There are faces you don't need to remember by name. The moment you see them, you recognize something larger than the person themselves. Harrison Ford is one of those faces. Not loud, not attention-seeking, not carefully constructed for the spotlight. And maybe that's exactly what made him different. Because when you look at the characters he gave the world, Indiana Jones, the archaeologist who moves forward despite fear, or Han Solo, the smuggler who hides instinct beneath indifference, you begin to notice something. They aren't perfect. They don't try to be heroes. And yet, they become them. And the strange part is, the man behind them never behaved like a star. No major scandals, no relentless self-promotion, no carefully crafted public persona, just a man doing his work, and then quietly stepping away from the spotlight. In an industry built on attention, he was someone who never seemed to chase it. And that creates a contradiction. A man who became a legend without ever trying to be one. But if it wasn't fame, then what brought him there? What happens when an actor becomes a global icon, yet never truly wanted to be a star? The answer doesn't begin on screen. It begins somewhere far easier to overlook. Harrison Ford was born in 1942 in Chicago. Not into a world of cameras or expectation, but into something far more ordinary. A middle-class family, no strong artistic legacy, no clear path leading toward performance or fame or even visibility. Nothing about his beginnings suggested what would come later. As a child, he wasn't the kind of presence people remembered. Quiet, reserved, often overlooked. Not because he lacked something obvious, but because he never tried to project anything outward. In school, he wasn't the center of attention. Not the loud one, not the charismatic one. If anything, he blended in. And for a long time, that invisibility stayed with him. There's a common idea in Hollywood that stars are recognizable early, that something in them stands out, even before success arrives. But in his case, there was no early signal, no sign of star quality, no sense of inevitability, just a young man moving quietly through life without any clear indication that he would one day carry entire films on his shoulders. And maybe that's where the story truly begins. Not with ambition, not with talent waiting to be discovered, but with someone who, for a long time, was almost invisible, before the name became recognizable, before the roles that would define generations. There was a long stretch of time where nothing seemed to work. When Harrison Ford first arrived in Hollywood, he wasn't seen as someone with star potential. Not enough charisma, not strong enough presence, not what casting directors imagined when they thought of a leading man. He was given small roles, minor appearances, parts that came and went, without leaving any real impression. And slowly, the message became clear. This might not work. But unlike many others, he didn't respond with desperation. He didn't try to force his way into attention, didn't reshape himself to fit expectations, didn't chase visibility at any cost. Instead, he stepped sideways. To support his family, he became a carpenter, not as a temporary phase, not as a dramatic fallback, but as something practical, something real. He built cabinets, worked with his hands, lived a life that had nothing to do with red carpets or recognition. And yet, he never fully walked away from acting. That's the detail that matters. Because this wasn't a story of someone chasing a dream relentlessly. And it wasn't a story of someone giving up. It was something quieter. He stayed, without expectation, without urgency, without the need for success to validate the effort. While others were trying to become stars, he was simply refusing to leave the game. And that difference, subtle, almost invisible, would eventually change everything. Not because he pushed harder than anyone else, but because he lasted longer than the moment that told him to stop. Sometimes, a turning point doesn't arrive as a decision. It arrives as an accident. At the time, Harrison Ford was still working as a carpenter, still building a life outside the industry that had never fully accepted him. Through connections, he was asked to help with something small, reading lines, not for himself, not as an audition, but to assist other actors during casting sessions for a new film directed by George Lucas. The project was called Star Wars. At that moment, it was just another uncertain production. No one knew it would redefine cinema, and he wasn't there to be discovered. He was there to help. But something happened in those readings. A presence that had once been described as not enough suddenly felt exactly right. Natural, unforced, grounded in a way that others weren't. And almost without intention, he became Han Solo, a smuggler, a cynic, a man who didn't believe in heroes, and yet became one. What followed was immediate. Not just success, but connection. Because Han Solo wasn't perfect. He wasn't noble in the traditional sense. He doubted. He resisted. He hesitated. And that made him real. Audiences didn't just admire him. They recognized something in him. And almost overnight, the man who had been overlooked for years became one of the most recognizable faces in the world. From small roles and quiet rejection, to the center of a cultural phenomenon, from carpenter to A-list. But even then, something about him didn't change. Because unlike many who arrive at that level, he didn't behave like someone who had been waiting for it. There was no sense of arrival, no transformation into a star, just a man, continuing to do the work. And in that quiet continuity, a different kind of career began. If Han Solo made him recognizable, then Indiana Jones made him unforgettable. In 1981, with Raiders of the Lost Ark, something shifted, not just in his career, but in the idea of what a hero could be. Because before this, action heroes were often defined by certainty. They didn't hesitate. They didn't doubt. They didn't break. But Indiana Jones did. He was intelligent but impulsive, capable but vulnerable, brave but visibly afraid. He ran from danger, got hurt, made mistakes, and still, he moved forward. Not because he was fearless, but because he wasn't. And that detail changed everything. Because for the first time, the audience wasn't watching perfection. They were watching someone human, someone who reacted, someone who struggled, someone who kept going, even when control slipped away. And that realism, quiet, almost unspoken, became Harrison Ford's defining signature. He didn't play heroes as ideals. He played them as people. There was weight in his movements, fatigue in his expression, a sense that every decision cost something, and that made the character believable. But more importantly, it made him relatable. Indiana Jones didn't redefine the hero by becoming stronger. He redefined the hero by becoming more human. And in doing so, Harrison Ford did something rare. He didn't just create an iconic character. He changed the way audiences understood what an icon could be. By the 1980s and into the 1990s, Harrison Ford had become something undeniable. Not just successful, not just recognizable, but one of the most bankable actors in the world. Film after film carried his presence, and audiences followed. In Blade Runner, he became a man questioning what it means to be human. In The Fugitive, he turned desperation into quiet intensity. In Air Force One, he stood at the center of power, without ever losing a sense of realism. Different roles, different worlds, but always the same core, grounded, controlled, unforced, and with that consistency, his name became enough. No spectacle required, no reinvention needed. Studios trusted him. Audiences believed him. He was, by every measurable standard, at the top. And yet, something about him didn't match the moment. And because this was also the era of the Hollywood celebrity, interviews, public personas, carefully managed visibility. Stars were expected not just to perform on screen, but to exist constantly in the public eye, to be seen, to be known, to be followed. But he didn't play that game. No relentless PR, no crafted image designed to be consumed. He gave interviews when necessary, appeared when required, and then disappeared again. Not as mystery, not as strategy, just as preference. And that created a quiet contradiction. The most recognizable face in the room was often the least interested in being recognized. He wasn't building a brand. He wasn't maintaining an image. He was simply continuing his work. And in doing so, he became something rare, a star defined not by visibility, but by presence. Not by how often he was seen, but by how deeply he was believed. In a system built on attention, he proved that you could reach the very top without ever chasing it. By the late 1990s, something began to shift. Not in Harrison Ford, but in the industry around him. Hollywood was changing. Studios moved toward franchises, toward spectacle, toward stories built not around actors, but around systems. Characters became repeatable, worlds became expandable, and technology, CGI, scale, visual dominance, began to take center stage. The kind of presence that once defined a film was no longer enough on its own. And for many actors of his generation, this moment required adaptation, reinvention, repositioning, a willingness to fit into a new structure. But he didn't. He didn't reshape himself to match the trend, didn't chase the new rhythm of the industry, didn't rebuild his image to stay at the top. And slowly, the results began to show. Some films didn't land. Some performances didn't carry the same weight at the box office. The numbers changed, the visibility shifted, and from the outside, it looked like decline, but it wasn't. Because nothing about his approach suggested loss. There was no desperation, no attempt to reclaim what had been, only a quiet consistency. He continued choosing roles the same way, continued working the same way, continued being the same person. And that's what makes this moment different. This wasn't a fall from the top. It was a decision not to chase it anymore. In an industry that rewards adaptation, he chose stability. In a system that demands reinvention, he chose identity. And in doing so, he stepped out of the race without ever announcing it. In Hollywood, returns are rarely about endings. They are about revival, about extending relevance, about proving that something still works. But when Harrison Ford returned, it felt different. he stepped back into Star Wars, The Force Awakens, not as the man audiences remembered, but as someone who had aged with the character. Han Solo was no longer the confident smuggler. The edge was still there, but quieter, heavier. There was time in his voice, distance in his presence, and for the first time, the myth felt mortal. Not broken, but complete. Then came the final return, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Indiana Jones was no longer running toward adventure. He was standing at the edge of it, slower, more reflective, carrying not just wounds, but years. And that changed everything, because these weren't performances built to reclaim something. They weren't attempts to prove relevance or to recreate the past. They were acknowledgments of time, of limits, of endings. In an industry that often avoids closure, that keeps stories open for as long as they remain profitable, this felt almost unfamiliar. A character allowed to age, a journey allowed to conclude, a legacy allowed to settle instead of expand. And maybe that's what made these returns so rare. They weren't about bringing something back to life. They were about letting it end with dignity, not louder, not bigger, just complete. When people talk about great actors, they often talk about range, technique, transformation, the ability to disappear into a role. And by that standard, Harrison Ford was never trying to be the most technical. He didn't chase complexity for its own sake, didn't build performances to impress. But what he did instead lasted longer. Because across decades, across genres, across entirely different worlds, something remained constant. A kind of presence that felt real, not elevated, not exaggerated, just human. And that is where his legacy truly lives. Not in perfection, but in recognition. Because characters like Indiana Jones and Han Solo didn't become iconic because they were larger than life. They became iconic because they weren't. They hesitated. They doubted. They reacted like people, not symbols. And through that, he helped redefine something subtle, but fundamental. The idea of a hero, not as someone without fear, but as someone who moves forward with it. Not as someone above the audience, but as someone within reach of them. A relatable hero. And beyond the screen, he carried the same principle into his own life. He never performed fame, never turned himself into a product. No constant visibility. No carefully maintained persona, just distance, consistency, and a refusal to become what the system expected. And that, perhaps, is the quiet proof at the center of his story. That a star does not need to behave like a star to become one. Which brings us back to the question: what happens when an actor becomes a global icon without ever truly wanting to be one? The answer is simple. He didn't become a legend by chasing fame. He became one because he never needed it. At the beginning of this story, there was no spotlight, no expectation, no sense of arrival waiting ahead. Just a man working with his hands, building something real, living a life far removed from the idea of fame. Harrison Ford did not enter Hollywood as a future icon. He entered it as someone who almost didn't belong there. And yet, over time, he became one of the most recognizable figures in modern cinema. Not by chasing attention, not by reshaping himself to fit the system, but by remaining exactly who he was, from carpenter to global symbol. The scale changed. The world around him changed, but the core never did. And maybe that's what makes this story different. Because most journeys in Hollywood are defined by transformation, by reinvention, by the ability to adapt and survive within a shifting industry. But his story follows a quieter path, not one of becoming someone else, but of refusing to. And in that refusal, something rare emerges. Not just success, but permanence. Because in the end, what stays with people isn't just the characters he played, it's the feeling behind them. The sense that what they were watching was never performance alone, it was presence. And that leads to a simple truth. Some men chase fame, others become timeless by ignoring it. An actor, an icon, a man who never tried to become a legend. Harrison Ford did not build a career around attention. He didn't shape himself to be remembered. And yet, he is. Not because he reached for greatness, but because he never needed to. Because sometimes, what lasts is not what demands to be seen, but what remains long after the spotlight moves on. If you are drawn to the quiet truth behind legendary names, subscribe to Icons and Legacies, where we explore not just fame, but what remains after it fades.
Thank you.